Starting for today, we're going to be moving on to our penultimate topic, and that is looking at the idea of market power. Now, a lot of the theory that we've studied up until this point has been looking at competitive markets. Those sorts of markets where the actions of firms do not influence the prices paid in those markets. Well, what we're going to do in today's lecture is look at two types of markets where firms are able to exercise market power, where their actions affect the prices. And these two market structures that we're going to look at are going to be monopoly, that type of market that you should all be familiar with. The monopolistic market in its strictest sense is where we have a single firm in the product market. That's the idea of a monopoly. And then moving on, then we're going to look at monopolistic competition. And if you think about what the definition of monopolistic competition is, it's quite strange. In monopolistic competition, there are a number of monopolists who compete against each other. Now, in its first definition, that might seem a little bit strange. How can you have monopolists who compete against each other? Well, we'll come on to that and explain it in detail in the second half of this lecture. So those are the two types of markets we're going to look at, where these firms exercise power, where they're price makers in the output market, in the product market. But as well as looking at how these markets operate and how firms decide upon the output that they're going to produce, what I'm also going to highlight for you are the efficiency implications of these types of market structure. And in particular, we're going to set the scene when we look at monopoly. We're going to compare it and contrast it against the scenario of perfect competition. What happens when there is a complete absence of market power? What does that mean for the efficiency of these markets? And I mentioned that word efficiency. I'm going to relate it back to a concept that I already taught you, and that's the idea of Pareto efficiency. So when I gave you that introduction to general equilibrium analysis, when we looked at how exchange would take place within an economy, we introduced that concept of Pareto efficiency. Well, we're going to revisit that concept when we look at market structure and look at the Pareto efficiency or the Pareto optimality of these types of markets. So that's a very broad overview of what we're going to do for the next lecture. So, on to the first type of market structure, and that's the idea of a monopolist. Now, the very fact that a monopolist is the only firm in the industry would mean that the industry demand curve, that downward sloping industry demand curve, will also be the individual demand curve that the monopolist faces. So given a downward sloping demand curve, the monopolist can choose to do one of two things. Well, firstly, and I guess the most intuitively appealing way to think of how a firm might behave, is that that firm chooses its price. It decides upon the price level it will want to set for its output, and then given the price it sets, it lets the market choose how much of its output it wishes to purchase. So that's one thing a monopolist could do. Choose price, and then the market demand curve will determine the amount of output purchased. Alternatively, though, what the monopolist could do is, rather than choosing price, it could choose the level of output. So a monopolist could choose how much output it wants to produce, and then given the output it produces, it then lets the market determine what price will you pay for that level of output. Well, both scenarios are exactly the same. We've got a demand curve, a downward sloping industry demand curve, and all the monopolist is doing is choosing a price and quantity combination. So in those two scenarios that I've run through, they are absolutely synonymous. They're exactly the same. You choose price and let the market determine output, or you choose output and let the market determine the price. They result in exactly the same outcome. However, analytically, it's easier if we follow the second of those two approaches. Working through it, it's just easier to explain, and it's probably easier to understand as well if we think about the monopolist choosing the level of output and then letting the market choose the price. Even though, intuitively, choosing price would be the way to go, but the outcomes are both exactly the same. Makes no difference whatsoever. Just analytically, we'll just adopt this approach here. Let the monopolist choose the output, and then once it's chosen its level of output, the market then determines the price it's willing to pay for that particular level of output. Now, rather than you spending all of the day copying out diagrams, there are a number of the diagrams on the handouts, and a number of the initial diagrams relating to the monopoly and the efficiency of monopoly. There are blank diagrams on the handouts for you, and you can just annotate them as we go along. So, the first part of monopoly that I want to cover is hopefully not new for you. It should act as revision. And in particular, what I want to do is introduce you to, or remind you of, an aspect of inefficiency that you're already familiar with. The idea of the deadweight loss of the monopoly. Give you that just to remind you about the sort of scenario that we're going to tell. But compare the monopolised market with the instance of perfect competition. So we've got two poles. One is we've got a very, very large number of firms in the market who have no influence over price. That's perfect competition. Well, we're going to compare and contrast that with the case of monopoly, where there's only a single producer within the market, and that firm does have the ability to influence prices. So, our starting point then is this diagram here, where that downward sloping demand curve is the industry demand curve. That's the demand curve that the monopolist faces for its output. If it wants to sell more output, the only way it can do that is by reducing price. That's our law of demand. So a conventional downward sloping market demand curve. Well, if that's the market demand curve, there will also be an associated marginal revenue curve. And again, as revision for you, the marginal revenue curve will slope downwards more steeply than the demand curve. So marginal revenue shows us the increase in total revenue as we sell an extra unit of output. It will slope downwards more steeply below the demand curve. And the only other curve on the diagram is this one here, which is our marginal cost curve. Marginal cost, we know, will eventually slope upwards. So again, these are all things that you should be familiar with, that you'll all remember from studying last year. If you don't, well, they're there for you now. So, what I want to do, first of all, is look at this idea here of the marginal cost curve. Well, that shows the marginal cost curve for the monopolist, but I also want you to think about what it means for a perfectly competitive firm. Under perfect competition, what price is charged? Perfectly competitive firms charge a price equal to the marginal cost of production. So, that marginal cost curve for a perfectly competitive industry will trace out the industry supply curve. So, it's the marginal cost curve for the monopolist, but it's the industry supply curve for a competitive industry. So, what would a competitive market do? It clears where demand and supply are equated. So that is the industry demand curve. That is the industry supply curve. So if this market were supplied competitively, if there were a large number of firms competing against each other, all producing the exact same product, where no individual firm has an ability to influence prices, that's our definition of perfect competition, the market would clear where demand and supply were equated. So if this were a competitive industry, there we go, that point there, where demand and supply are equated, is where the market would clear. So a competitive market would produce output up to that level XC, and if it produces that much output, the market will pay a price of PC. So that is our competitive output level. Now what we know about a competitive output level is it is efficient. It's the most efficient type of market that you can get. It will maximise consumer and producer surplus. So, in terms of consumer surplus, what is consumer surplus? Consumer surplus is that net benefit that consumers get from paying a lower price for something they value more highly. If you value something at £20 and yet you can buy it at £10, you would make a net surplus of £10. You only pay £10, but you'd be prepared to pay 20. The difference between the two is consumer surplus. And on our diagram here, that area bounded between the demand curve and the price line, that is the consumer surplus. That's the net benefit that consumers get from paying a lower price for something they value more highly. That represents the benefit that consumers get from paying a price of PC for something they would have been prepared to pay more for. So that's consumer surplus. In this type of market, though, there is also a surplus to producers that you would have seen before, described as producer surplus. And producer surplus, if you want to, you can also think of producer surplus as profit. It represents the fact that producers receive a higher price for something it costs them less to produce. So if we look at the diagram here, all of these units between 0 and XC, the marginal cost of production, i.e. the cost of producing an extra unit, is less than the price received, which is PC. And the difference between the two is producer surplus. And what you would have seen before is the idea that what a competitive market does is it maximises the sum of consumer and producer surplus. That we can't get any extra benefit, net benefit, out of this market. However, that's the starting point, and that's perfect competition. What, though, about a monopolist? Well, in the monopoly, there is a concept known as a deadweight loss, a deadweight social loss. And it's a loss of the benefits to producers and consumers. So, how would we identify that? Well, we've identified the situation of perfect competition, where an output level of XC is produced and a price charged of PC per unit. And monopoly, though, what does it do? Well, we know a monopolist restricts output. But to what point does it restrict output? And why does it restrict output? Well, it restricts output to maximise profits. And profits are maximised where marginal revenue and marginal costs are equated. I won't go through what this again, I'm assuming this is prior knowledge for you. Marginal revenue and marginal costs being equated, that's the profit maximising level of output. So that is our marginal revenue curve, sloping downwards more steeply below the demand curve. That is our marginal cost curve, sloping upwards. Marginal revenue and marginal cost are equated, the two curves intersect at that point there on the diagram. So that says the most profitable level of output So the level of output that maximises profits is an output level XM. Anywhere to the left of XM, marginal revenue, marginal cost are not equated. Anywhere to the right of XM, again, marginal revenue and marginal cost are not equated. So, for all the output levels that the monopolist could produce, the most profitable one is an output level XM. And so, if the monopolist produces that level of output, what price would it charge? Well, then we just read off the demand curve. If you produce XM units of output, the market will pay a price of PM. So we said that PC and XC were the competitive price and output. The monopolist restricts output to XM, and by restricting output, it forces the price up. And it forces it up to a level of PM. So we've got different price and output combinations. And it's this different price and output combination that leads to this dead weight loss. Very quickly then, just to identify that then, again, this producer surplus. Again there is consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is the net benefit that consumers derive, paying a lower price, for something they would have been prepared to pay more for. It's that area above the price line and below the demand curve. So remember, the monopolist is only producing XM units of output. So consumer surplus on those XM units is that shaded area there. And in the same way, on these XM units of output, there is producer surplus. And that producer surplus is the area between the marginal cost curve and the price line. For all of these units in that shaded area, the cost of producing the extra unit, that is the marginal cost, is less than the price. And so, we sum that over all of those XM units, and that shaded red area there is the producer surplus. But if you compare this, if you compare that to the previous diagram, you'll see that the sum of those two areas is smaller. The monopolised output, the restriction of output, forcing up the market price, means that this area here is not gained by anybody. It's not gained by the producer, it's not gained by the consumer. That is our net deadweight loss of monopoly. And everything that you would have done up until this point, that's the idea of the monopoly inefficiency that you've been taught. And that is perfect. Nothing about that is going to change. By restricting the market output and forcing the price up, it results in an inefficient market outcome. And we can value the extent of that inefficiency by that area there in the diagram. That's the loss that nobody gets. It's lost to society. So that measures the inefficiency of monopoly. What I want to do now, though, is that something, that little bit something extra, is now reinterpret that diagram, but not in terms of those net consumer and producer surpluses, but rather revisit that diagram in terms of this concept of Pareto efficiency. Now, the one thing that isn't going to change is that monopolised outcome is inefficient. Just because we look at it in terms of Pareto optimality or Pareto inefficiency, it isn't suddenly going to disappear. Absolutely, it is still inefficient. But I want you to think about it in terms of that concept of Pareto efficiency instead. Now, the one thing you need to remember, as we touched upon in one of our previous lectures, what is a Pareto efficient outcome? A Pareto efficient outcome will occur when there's no way of making somebody better off without making somebody else worse off. So if the only way you can make someone else is improve their outcome, the only way you can do that is at someone else's expense, that is a Pareto efficient outcome. Okay? So remember that, and now we're going to reinterpret that diagram. So, in terms of the monopolist, what does it do? It restricts output to XM. It produces less output than a competitive market would produce. It produces XM, a competitive market would produce XC. Now what I want you to do though, is think about it. The monopolist not producing XM, but rather what would happen to the monopolist if it produced one extra, only one extra unit of output. That's all. Well, on a diagram, there we go. That is our one extra unit of output. Left to its own devices, the monopolist will produce XM. Well, now, what I'm saying, what would happen if it produces just one extra unit? And that's what I want you to think about. So that one extra unit that's produced. What can we say about the monopolist? What can we say about consumers? Well, if you look at that one extra, and only that one extra unit, what price could that one extra unit be sold for? Well, that unit there, if we look at the demand curve, that tells us that one extra unit could be sold for a price of P1. Just that one extra unit. Our demand curve shows us the valuation by consumers, how much they're willing to pay for output. So that one extra unit could be sold for a price of P1. There are consumers out there who'd be willing to pay that price, P1. However, what does it cost the monopolist to produce that one extra unit? Or what is the marginal cost of that one extra unit? Well, that's our one extra unit. There's the marginal cost curve. And so there is the marginal cost of that one extra unit. It's P2. So, if the monopolist produces one extra unit of output, just one extra unit of output, it could produce it for a price of P2, but customers would be willing to pay a price for that unit of P1. So think back to this idea of Pareto efficiency. Is there scope to make a Pareto improvement? Could we make one party better off without making the other party worse off? Or put it in an even simpler way, could we make both of these better off? Well, let's take an example, and this purely is an example. Let's say that one extra unit. What would happen if that extra unit was sold for a price of PC? Would consumers be better off? Yes or no? Consumers on that one extra unit were willing to pay a price of P1. And yet we can say we could sell it to them for a price of PC. So are the consumers better off? Well, yeah. They're paying a lower price for something they value more highly. So if we, on that one extra unit, said, let's sell it for a price of PC, consumers would be better off. They would be prepared to pay up to a price of P1, but they only end up paying a price of PC. So consumers are obviously better off. They would benefit from that unit being sold for a price of PC. Okay, so consumers are better off, but what about the monopolist? Would the monopolist be better off? Yes or no? Lots of blank faces looking at me. Would the monopolist be... We can see that, okay. To make a Pareto improvement, we can't make one person better off at the expense of the other. So I've said that the consumer is better off. They would pay a lower price PC, but they would have been prepared to pay more. What about the monopolist? Would the monopolist benefit from selling that unit for a price of PC? Give you a clue, the answer is yes. The monopolist would receive a price of PC, but it only costs the monopolist P2 to produce. So what we've got on that one extra unit is that clearly there is scope to make a Pareto improvement. We can make both parties better off. Consumers would pay a lower price, but they would have been prepared to pay more. The producer receives a higher price from what he would have been prepared to accept less for. It costs less to produce. So obviously here, that unit there, if that one extra unit is sold, we can make a Pareto improvement. We can make both parties better off. And if you can make both parties better off, that is a Pareto improvement. And so, if we're making a Pareto improvement, that output level there at XM cannot be Pareto efficient. It is just not Pareto efficient. We can make both parties better off. So it just is not Pareto efficient. But we've talked about that one extra unit. But it isn't just that one extra unit above XM. It's all units. Exactly the same line of reasoning would apply to all of those units between XM and XC. If you look at those units there, all you need to do is look at the marginal cost curve and the demand curve. Now, another way of interpreting the demand curve is the marginal valuation curve. It represents the value that consumers place on the next unit. And what value do they place on it? That's the price that they're prepared to pay. And for all of these units between XM and XC, the price that consumers are willing to pay, their marginal valuation, as I'm tracing out there on the demand curve, is greater than the marginal cost. So consumers benefit more, are willing to pay more than it actually costs to produce. And whenever that's the case, there is scope to make a Pareto improvement. We can make both parties better off. We ran through one very specific unit here, but exactly the same line of reasoning will apply to all of those units between XM and XC. And that will continue until we arrive at that point there. Until the monopolist, until the market is producing XC units of output. That is the competitive output level. Because at the competitive output level, the marginal valuation, that is the price that consumers are willing to pay, is exactly equal to the marginal cost of production. And any Pareto efficient outcome will be at exactly that point, where the marginal cost and marginal valuation are equated. And any output level beyond XC, we can see the price that consumers are willing to pay on the demand curve is less than the cost of production. So obviously, it doesn't benefit anybody to produce extra output. And so, XC, the competitive output level, is our Pareto efficient level of output. And so, the monopolised output level is Pareto inefficient. So, again, what I said is we weren't going to invent the wheel. I wasn't going to suddenly say that this output level produced by the monopolist was not anything other than inefficient. All we've done is put a slightly different complexion on it and talked about it in terms of Pareto inefficiency. So whilst it's obvious that the monopolised output level is Pareto inefficient, doesn't it seem a little bit strange then why the monopolist doesn't produce it? Didn't I say, when we talked about that one extra unit, we said if the monopolist produced that unit, they would benefit from it. They would receive more, they could receive more for that unit than it cost to produce. Why then doesn't the monopolist produce that extra unit of output? When we talked about this concept of Pareto inefficiency, we said if it's Pareto inefficient, if we expand output, both parties could benefit. Well, if the monopolist could benefit, why doesn't it produce that output? Doesn't it seem a little bit strange? Well, if you listen back to the language that I've used when I've defined this idea of Pareto efficiency, I've always talked about the next unit, or the marginal unit. And that's the angle that this idea of Pareto efficiency takes. It looks at the marginal unit, the next unit. I said, if the monopolist produced that extra unit, what would customers be prepared to pay for that unit? Not for all units, for that unit, that next marginal unit. What is the cost of producing that next marginal unit? And that is what the concept of Pareto looks at. It looks at marginal units. And when we get to our Pareto efficient outcome here, that perfectly competitive outcome, where the marginal valuation and marginal cost are equated, well, that's what a competitive firm would do. It would look at the marginal unit. How much can I sell this next unit for? How much does it cost me to produce this next unit? Because competitive firms can't affect prices. But expressly because we're looking at a monopolist who has market power, what happens when the monopolist produces that next unit? What happens to the price of all preceding units? It falls. So when we've talked about Pareto efficiency, that's all in terms of marginal units. But the monopolist is not interested in the marginal unit. The monopolist is interested in all units. And it's interested in all units because it's all units that determine its profits. And so, if it wanted to sell this one extra unit, what would it have to do? It would have to drop the price on all preceding units as well. And if it did this, it would reduce its profits. And that's why the monopolist won't produce all of these extra units between XM and XC. Because in doing so, it affects its profitability. So even though we've looked at this in terms of Pareto efficiency, the point that I want you to take from this is Pareto efficiency only looks at marginal units. But the monopolist isn't interested in marginal units, it's interested in all units. And if it drops the price for one unit, it's got to drop the price for all units. And hence, that's why this monopoly diagram here and the monopolised level of output is Pareto inefficient. However, you think back to what I've said. I've said the reason the monopolist doesn't produce that extra unit of output is because if it did, it would have to drop the price of all preceding units, and that would make it less profitable. But what would happen, though, if the monopolist didn't have to drop the price of all preceding units? And a monopolist is able to do this, because a monopolist, or firms with market power, are in a unique position. Because they're price makers, they can set the prices they want to charge. And they can charge customers different prices. That is, they're able to price discriminate. And if they're able to price discriminate, those arguments that we just rehearsed with Pareto inefficiency, maybe, just maybe, they're going to change. And that's what I want to lead on to now. What would happen if the monopolist is able to practice price discrimination? If it's able to charge different prices to different customers. Now, there are 3 different types of price discrimination. Rather than copying them down, they're all on the handout there for you. So I'll quickly run through them. There are 3 different types, 3 different classifications of price discrimination: first degree, second degree, and third degree. Now, I'm not going to have time to go through a full rendition of all 3 of these, but we're going to look at, in particular, we're going to concentrate some examples later on of perfect or first degree price discrimination. So I'll give you the definitions first of all, and then I'm going to throw some questions out there at you. So first degree price discrimination, also referred to as perfect price discrimination, is when the monopolist sells different units of output for different prices. Okay, that's the same with all types. And these prices may differ from person to person. That's the crucial part. These prices may differ from person to person. That's first degree. Second degree price discrimination is the monopoly sells different units of output for different prices. This is the important part. But every individual who buys the same amount of the good pays the same price. Again, monopolists charging different prices, different customers. This one, second degree, is related to the amount that's purchased. And lastly, third degree price discrimination, the most prevalent form of price discrimination that there is, and you yourselves will probably be very, very familiar with third degree price discrimination. This is when the monopolist sells output to different people for different prices. That part of the definition hasn't changed, but every unit of output sold to a given person sells for the same price. So because of the unique position a monopolist finds itself in, it's able to charge different prices to different customers. So, what I want to do is just get you to think a little bit. This weekend it's my wife's birthday, so I've got to think, okay, I've got to take her out somewhere. No, not I have to. I want to take my wife out. I want to take my wife out somewhere, and so, okay, what we'll do, we'll get a babysitter in, we'll go out for a meal, and well, let's say we'll go to the movies. So I've checked out what is in the cinemas this weekend, and okay, I've decided what we'll do, we'll go and watch Murder on the Orient Express. I know it's not particularly good, but I don't think she wanted to watch the sorts of movies that I'm interested in. What's the League of... What's the one the superheroes one? Tell me, what's it called? Justice League, that's the one I'd prefer to go and watch, but I don't think my wife is going to be particularly enamoured watching that for 2 hours with me on a Saturday night. So, there you go, Murder on the Orient Express. However, if I then go, if I want to book tickets, there you go. If I go and get a ticket for each of us, it will cost me £10.25 per ticket. Okay, I'm not complaining about the price, hope you understand that, but that's what it's going to cost me. However, if you go to watch the very same movie in the very, very same movie theatre, potentially sitting in the very, very same seats, there you go, as a student, you would pay only £8.50. So the cinema would charge you a lower price than it would charge me. And it's selling us exactly the same thing. A seat in the cinema to watch the exact same movie. Yet you get charged a lower price than me. Obviously, this is an example of price discrimination. Very quickly though, question, and I'll get you to use, everyone got their phones? Use Kahoot in a few minutes. Is this an example of first, second, or third degree price discrimination? That is an example of third degree price discrimination. So that one's got. Every unit of output sold to a given person sells for the same price. If I buy 1 ticket, 2 tickets, or 3 tickets, it makes no difference. I still pay the exact same price. Doesn't matter how many tickets you buy, you will still pay the exact same price. But there will be a different price between what I pay and what you pay. So that is an example. It's the most prevalent form of price discrimination. It's why do pensioners get reduction for rail travel or bus travel? Why do students get discounts in nightclubs or cinemas? You're more price sensitive. You've got a lower willingness to pay. And the monopolist charges a lower price to those. And those customers with a higher willingness or ability to pay, it charges a higher price to. That is third degree price discrimination. Okay? So one option is I could take my wife to the movies. The other one is maybe we can go away for the weekend. So I'm thinking, okay, a little bit of late or early winter sunshine. I've checked out the weather forecast in Rome, and it looks pretty nice for the weekend. So I'll finish all my lectures, my teaching duties for this week. Let's go for a long weekend and come back sometime next week. Okay? Rome looks pretty nice. So, nicer than Swansea. Okay. So, check out the flights. From Rome, from Cardiff to Rome, there you go, the times you want to go, £419 per person. That's what it would cost me to take my wife to Rome for a long weekend. That's, if we travel, economy class, cattle class. If I travel the exact same flight, but rather than going economy class, I then went business class instead. You can see, look, it's the same plane. We're leaving at the same time, arriving at the same time, same stopover. That is the same flight. And yet, if I travel business class, it's going to cost me an awful lot more. So, what are the airlines doing? This is an example of price discrimination. There's one price for economy class travel. There's one price for business class travel. So, again, that question for you. That's an example of price discrimination, but is it first degree? Is it second degree? Or is it third degree price discrimination? Okay. This is an example of second degree price discrimination. Now, when I gave you that definition of price discrimination, second degree, this fine. But every individual who buys the same amount of the good pays the same price. Well, that's a strict definition. More often, what firms do, if they're able to influence prices, rather than constructing price quantity packages, they'll actually construct price quality packages. So they'll offer, rather than different amounts of the good, they will offer the same good, but then has different quality associated with it. And what's the difference? And I said it was exactly the same flight, exactly the same plane, if you travel business class or economy class. Is that quite true? Is it exactly the same? It's obviously not. Business class has got a high quality. And it's not the fact that the airlines ensure that business class is high quality. What they actually do is they downgrade the service, they downgrade the quality of the economy class travel to make it less attractive to business class passengers. Which is why you have seats that have got a little bit less legroom. Which is why you need advanced bookings. There's no flexibility once you've made your flight confirmation. So again, this is an example of second degree price discrimination. But it does not matter what type of price discrimination we're looking at, be it first degree, second degree, or third-degree price discrimination. The important thing, in order to be able to practice it, a monopolist must be able to do two things. The first thing is it must know that there are different groups of customers out there. It must be able to identify them. So when you turn up to buy your cinema ticket, how does the cinema identify you as a student? That you're required to bring in your ID with you. And if you haven't got an ID, you don't get the reduction. So that's the first thing. In order for price discrimination to take effect, it's not just there are different groups of customers out there with different willingnesses to pay, but the monopolist must be able to identify them. And it doesn't matter what type of price discrimination we're on about, that point must always be true. You need to identify your customers, be able to differentiate between them. But the ability to identify customers, whilst it's necessary, it isn't sufficient. What the monopolist must also be able to do is prevent the possibility of resale. If it can't, arbitrage is going to take place. Those customers who can buy the output at a lower price will do so. And then, if the monopolist cannot prevent resale, they will then just resell it to the high demand customer for a price that undercuts the monopolist. So if the prevention of resale isn't possible, price discrimination isn't possible. So for any type of price discrimination, you've got to be able to identify your customers, but also prevent the possibility of resale. Perfect price discrimination. So the definition that I gave you first of all, what perfect price discrimination is, what it means is that, it's an extreme form. It's an extreme form of price discrimination, which is why of the three types, I'm only going to go through this one particular type with you as the ultimate scenario of price discrimination and what the monopolist is able to do. And under first degree or perfect price discrimination, the monopolist sells each and every unit of output to that customer who's willing to pay the highest amount for that unit. And that's the price that they pay, that maximum amount for each and every unit. So let's say, just to explain what we mean by this, this is our, as we've seen before, that's our conventional downward sloping demand curve. And this means that as the monopolist produces more output, customers are willing to pay less for successive units of output. Well, what the customer knows, what the monopolist knows, for example, is for that particular unit there, QA, that there's someone out there who's willing to pay a price of PA for that particular unit QA. That's what we read off from the demand curve. And it's that price of PA that that particular unit is sold for. The customer values that unit at a price of PA, and that is the exact price that he pays. Similarly, the monopolist also knows that there's a customer out there who's willing to pay a price of PB for that particular unit QB. And that customer is sold that unit for that price. The maximum amount that they're prepared to pay. And the monopolist will do this for each and every unit of output, all the way up to this unit here, QC. And for that unit QC, the monopolist knows that there's someone out there who's willing to pay a price of PC. And that is the exact price that he pays. Now, any units beyond QC, if we look at the price that the customers are willing to pay and the marginal cost or the cost of producing that extra unit, the cost is higher. So it's not profitable of the monopolist to produce any units, to sell any units in excess of QC. And so, what we get is the monopolist will sell all units up until QC. And it will sell them to those customers who's willing to pay the maximum possible price. So it means in terms of the market outcome that we get, if the monopolist produces all of those units up until QC, and QC, for that last unit, that's where the marginal cost of production is equal to the marginal valuation, the price that consumers are willing to pay. And what did we identify that as previously? That was the competitive output level. A competitive market will produce units all the way up until QC. And for each of those, it will charge a price of PC. But the perfectly price discriminating monopolist doesn't do that in quite the same sense. It does produce all of those units up until QC, but it doesn't sell them for a price of PC. It's only the very, very last unit that sells for that price. All other units are sold for the maximum price possible. So what does this then mean in terms of the benefits that accrue to the customers and to the monopolist? Well, we get the same output level as under perfect competition. Therefore, a perfectly price discriminating monopolist will produce a Pareto efficient level of output. That last unit sold, the marginal valuation, is equal to the marginal cost of production. It is Pareto efficient. However, there's a decided imbalance between the benefits that derive to the monopolist and consumers. Now, previously, when we've looked at markets, consumers have always got something. There's always been some consumer surplus, because consumers have paid a lower price for something they value more highly. But what about this diagram here? Do consumers ever pay a lower price for something they value more highly? Never ever happens. On each and every unit, the price paid by consumers is what they would be prepared to pay. There is no consumer surplus. That entire shaded area there is the total valuation of consumers for all of those units. And what price do they pay? They pay that entire area there. So that shaded area is all either costs, that lower part there, or that triangle I'm tracing out, producer surplus. There is absolutely no consumer surplus under perfect price discrimination. The monopolist gets absolutely everything. So even though we produce a Pareto efficient level of output, it's all to the benefit of the monopolist. The monopolist gets every single last bit of surplus available within this market, and consumers get nothing. So, is that Pareto efficient then? Well, I've said that it is. Why is it Pareto efficient? Well, the monopolist gets everything. The only way that you can make consumers better off is by taking something away from the monopolist. So the only way to make someone better off is by making someone else worse off. That's our definition of a Pareto efficient outcome. So even though this outcome under perfect price discrimination is Pareto efficient, it's far from equal. The monopolist gets everything. That is what the monopolist would always strive to do. Extract all possible surpluses from the market. Now, what I want to do, though, is give you an alternative interpretation of that perfect price discrimination. Because for the moment, it probably sounds a little bit idealised, a little bit perfect. Is this actually how firms operate? Well, I want to put a slightly different interpretation on it. rather than thinking about the monopolist selling each and every unit for a different price to that customer who values it most highly, I want you to think about perfect price discrimination as a pricing strategy where the firm sells a fixed amount of output for a take it or leave it price. So the firm will construct a quantity price package and it will say to customers, okay, that's your package. You can buy it or not. Take it or leave it. Right? So, take this example. The monopolist has identified two different customers. We've got person A and person B. And these two customers are different. They've got different willingnesses to pay for the monopolist's output. Person A has a much higher willingness to pay. His demand curve is drawn further out. Person B has a much lower willingness or ability to pay. His demand curve is drawn much closer to the origin. So for any given output level, person A is willing to pay an awful lot more. So, how does the monopolist perfectly price discriminate against these two customers? Now, if it charged them the same price, that wouldn't work. The customers would still derive some consumer surplus. How does it perfectly price discriminate? And by extension, if it perfectly price discriminates, the monopolist extracts all possible profit from this market. Well, what it would do is it would sell a certain amount of fixed output to each of these customers, and the price it would charge these customers would be their total willingness to pay. By charging them that gets all the profit from the market. So, I'll explain. To make it nice and simple, let's say that there is a constant marginal cost. So that's the marginal cost, it's fixed. So we say, perfect price discrimination. The price that you charge is equal to the total willingness to pay for a certain quantity. So, for example, what the monopolist would do, it would offer to sell person A an amount XA for a total price equal to that entire area under the demand curve. Now, what benefit, what consumer surplus does that person A get? None. His total willingness to pay is the total area under the demand curve. And what price is he paying? The total area under the demand curve. Now, don't think of this, your usual way of thinking about price. It is just some sort of metric along this axis. That's what I've identified here isn't a point on the axis. What I've identified is an area. It's a revenue. That total area is the price charged by the monopolist. So that would be XA units offered at that total shaded area. That's the price that the monopolist would offer to sell to person A. A certain amount XA for the total price equal to that shaded area. Now for person B, who's got a much lower willingness to pay, ability to pay, the monopolist would sell him a package that's got a lower quantity, XB, but for a total price equal to that shaded area in the diagram. And for person B, what net benefit does he gain? What consumer surplus does he gain? Nothing. What he pays for all of those units, that total amount of output, XB, the total price that he pays for all of those units is exactly equal to his valuation. So he gets no consumer surplus. So if you look at these two diagrams here, that is exactly the same as that diagram there. Here, we've got a single market, and the total price charge is equal to the total willingness to pay. Well, all we've got here are two different customers, two separate customers, and the total price charge to each of these customers equals their total willingness to pay. And in neither of these diagrams is there any consumer surplus. It's all profit, or it's all producer surplus for the monopolist. So again, that's an alternative interpretation of perfect price discrimination. Now, by the very language used, you might think, well, perfect price discrimination is an ideal. And it's difficult to think of wholly convincing examples of how firms are able to practice price discrimination in such a pure form. Probably the closest approximation to it is something like a small-town doctor in the US, where doctors in the US would charge for medical services. But a small-town doctor in the US would know his or her customers, would know the patients, would know their ability or willingness to pay. And so, on the left-hand side, this might well be the scenario that applies to the town lawyer, someone with a much higher ability to pay for the doctor services. What we have on the right-hand side is someone like a farm labourer with a much lower ability to pay. But the monopolist, the town doctor, is able to identify these two groups of customers and charges them a price related to their ability or willingness to pay. But in doing so, it's able to extract all possible surpluses from the market. That is perfect or first-degree price discrimination. Now, the way I've described it so far, you might think, well, it is very, very ideal. Does it really exist? Well, I've given you one example, but I want to just change the parameters slightly. Because this ability to extract all possible surpluses from the market does give us a very good insight into how a number of firms do adopt their pricing strategies. And in particular, it's a very good example of how theme parks set their prices. So I want to give you an idea of theme parks and what they would do. And the setup of this, when it's first proposed, it was looking at Disneyland. And the idea of Disneyland, we get an example of a theme park. What they do is they will have a theme park and they want to charge the customers a price of admission. They will also want to charge their customers a price for the rides and attractions available within the theme park. The problem is, though, is that there's obviously an interrelationship between the two. So the theme park, or Disneyland in this case, has the dilemma. How does it set a price of admission and a price for attractions such that it wants to maximise profits, knowing that there is that interrelationship between the two? And the higher the price you charge for admission, the lower the price people are willing to pay for the attractions within the theme park. Well, what we've done here, the way that these theme parks resolve this, is by using this principle of perfect price discrimination. So, what we're going to do is run through the so-called Disneyland dilemma. How do you set two different prices such that you maximise profits? But what we'll do is, to make it nice and simple moving forward, we'll make three simplifying assumptions. The first thing is that we'll say when customers get to Disneyland, there's only one ride, there's only one attraction in Disneyland. We'll also say that the only reason people want to go to Disneyland is for these rides. They're not interested in all of the other things available within the theme park. They only go in for the rides. And we'll also say that everyone has exactly the same tastes for rides. So, within this context, with those simplifying assumptions, Disneyland needs to think. Okay, I can charge people an admission fee, and then when they're in the park, I can charge them for the rides. How does it optimally set both prices such that it maximises profits? That is the so-called Disneyland dilemma. How does it set these two prices independently? It all boils down to this idea of perfect price discrimination. Knowing what customers are willing to pay, and charging them a price up and to that level, to the overall package. So, these diagrams are on the handouts. There's no need to copy anything down. Just listen, annotate, and then we can skip through this quite quickly. Okay, so, very, very simple framework. This is the demand curve that faces Disneyland. That's the demand curve for rides. And as the number of rides increases, the price that Disneyland can charge needs to fall. So it wants to get more customers on its rides, it needs to drop the price. So just a conventional downward sloping demand curve. To make it nice and easy, we'll say that the marginal cost of providing these rides is constant. So, what does Disneyland do? It wants to set a price for rides, and it also wants to set an admission fee, such that it maximises profits. So, let's say initially that Disneyland sets a price for each ride of P star. Well, if it sets a price of rides of P star, customers will demand X star rides. And what this means for Disneyland is that part of that price, that shaded area there, that just covers its costs. So it isn't making any profit on those. It covers its costs. So for the X star, it covers its marginal cost. But the price that it's charging is more than just the marginal cost. So that difference between costs and the price is profit. So by setting the price of P star, Disneyland is able to make a profit per ride, equal to that shaded area. But, again, go back now to this idea of perfect price discrimination. For X star rides, what is the total willingness of customers to pay for that many rides? It is the total area under the demand curve. It's that total area there. So if customers are only paying P star for X star rides, they must be deriving some consumer surplus. That's the net benefit they derive of paying a lower price for something they value more highly. They pay a price of P star, but they would have been prepared to pay more. So that total area, those three shaded areas, is the total willingness to pay for those X star rides. But what price is being charged? That area there, the profit and the costs. So that consumer surplus then represents the maximum admission fee that Disneyland can charge people to come into the theme park, and then subsequently charge them a price of P star per ride. But there's a problem, or there's an issue, because whilst Disneyland gets that area in the admission fee, it can't charge more than that, because if you charge more than that consumer surplus, what you charge customers is more than they'd be paid to pay. It's more than their valuation of those X star rides. So that consumer surplus is the absolute maximum admission fee that could be charged. But if they did charge that fee, the total amount that they would pay for X star rides would be that total area. But whilst Disneyland is making a profit, is it maximising profits? Well, it isn't, because on the diagram, that shaded area represents unexploited profits. If it could expand output, it could gain that area there by having additional profits, by capturing more from the market. And so what it does, rather than charging a price of P star, the way that it exploits this profit here is by reducing the price of individual rides. If you reduce the price, the demand for those rides will increase. And in doing so, the firm will make more profits. So, if it reduces the price down towards marginal cost, what happens? Well, the demand for rides will increase. Price comes down, demand shifts upwards. That area, as before, is costs. That area there, that covers its costs. That area there is now profit per ride. You can see it's been squeezed. It's not as large as it was previously. And that area that would have been consumer surplus, but Disneyland charges as an admission fee, has now got bigger. So, what's happened? So the admission fee goes up, the price that you're charging per ride is coming down. And that area of unexploited profits has got smaller. So it's benefited Disneyland by dropping the price of rides and increasing the admissions fee. It's gaining more from this market. But there's a little bit extra that can still be exploited, that part there. And that will continue. I mean, hopefully you can see what the scenario is. That reduction in price will continue until price is equal to the marginal cost of provision. So once price is equal to the marginal cost per ride, that portion will cover the costs. What are the profits per ride? There aren't any. The price that you're charging per ride of P star is exactly equal to the marginal cost. So there is no profit per ride. But that consumer surplus that customers would derive, that is now the maximum price of admission that can be charged. And that is exactly what theme parks do. They charge a price equal to the marginal cost per ride, and then all of that consumer surplus that would be generated is the admission fee. And so, on X-star rides, what do consumers get from this? What's the consumer surplus? There is none. The total amount that consumers pay is equal to their total valuation, or their total willingness to pay for those X-star rides. Now, you might be looking at me and say, hold on, theme parks don't do that. You don't pay a price to go in and then pay a price for each of the rides. Well, you don't, but when you go to theme parks, the marginal cost of a ride, it isn't zero, but it's sufficiently close to zero that it's not going to be worthwhile theme parks collecting that extra tariff from customers. So essentially, for all intents and purposes, we can assume that that is zero. So what do the theme parks do? They work out customers. What's their total willingness to pay for all the attractions and all of the rides when they enter? Once they've identified that is your consumer surplus. And that is the price that you would pay as your admissions fee. So where do the relative benefits lie in this sort of pricing strategy? Consumers get nothing. All of their consumer surplus is taken away. And all the profits go to the monopolist. So even though it might not look like it, we've got the exact same principle that lies behind this as we have with perfect price discrimination. You know your customer, you identify your customer, you know their total willingness to pay, and that is the price that you charge them. And so the monopolist, the firm, gets everything, and consumers get no net benefit. An exact example about theme parks exploit this idea of perfect price discrimination. Monopolistic competition. We said this was a type of market structure where a number of monopolists compete against each other, which in itself might seem a little bit strange. If it's monopolist, surely a monopolist produces a unique good, so how can other firms compete against it? Well, in monopolistic competition, what we have is a number of monopolists, each producing their very own unique good. That's true. But each and every one of these unique goods is, to a certain extent, a substitute for the output of the other monopolists. So there is, in this type of market structure, some sort of product differentiation. The monopolists are producing unique yet similar goods. And monopolistic competition will have aspects of both competitive markets and monopolised markets. And probably a very good example of a perfectly competitive market is the soft drinks industry. There is only one firm who produces Coca-Cola. There is only one firm who produces Pepsi-Cola. So these are monopolists producing their own unique outputs. But, to varying degrees, Pepsi-Cola and Coca-Cola are substitutes for one another. They are brands of what essentially is the same good. And that's the nature of monopolistic competition. But within a monopolistically competitive market, the price and output decisions of rivals are crucial. And as the number of rivals increases, or as the number of products gets larger and larger, as the number of products gets smaller and smaller, these interrelationships will change. And we've already talked about, at the beginning of today's lecture, perfect competition. Well, in perfect competition, there are a large number of firms, all producing exactly the same output. Well, when that happens then, we've got a large number of firms producing exactly the same output. What ability does an individual firm have to change price? None at all. Under perfect competition, the demand curve that firms face is horizontal. No firm has an ability to charge a different price to its rivals. However, in monopolistic competition, there aren't a large number of firms, there are only a limited number of firms. And they don't produce the exact same output. They produce unique but related output. Hence, individual firms will have the ability to influence prices, will have the ability to charge a different price than their rivals and not lose all of their customers. So in that sense then, a perfectly monopolistically competitive market will have a downward sloping demand curve. Firms can charge a higher price than rivals and not lose all of its customers. So in that sense, there are aspects of monopoly here. Firms still need to compete with rivals in terms of price and product specification for customers. So there is, though, a downward sloping demand curve. However, there are also aspects of monopoly. Firms must compete for customers. They've got a downward sloping demand curve, but that only takes them up to a certain level. You need to compete for customers, and price is obviously one of these things. Also, though, just like competitive markets, there are no barriers to entry, and in particular, high potential profits will attract new firms into the industry. And this idea that no restrictions against new firms entering the market, and what we're going to do next, this is the aspect that's crucial. It's this aspect that results in a very distinctive equilibrium outcome within monopolistically competitive markets. Now, whilst it's probably the most prevalent type of market structure, monopolistic competition is really complicated to analyse. Product details, the type of technology that the firm use, the strategic interaction between firms, they're all crucial. And it makes it very complicated to analyse. What I don't want to do is go into the industrial economics aspects of monopolistic competition, but I do want to give you an overview of what the equilibrium outcome within such a market will look like. And there are going to be three key aspects of this. In a moment, we'll see the diagram, but this diagram will be characterised by these three key points. The first two are obvious. The third one is a little bit more tricky. First thing, the first of the 3 points that will characterise equilibrium in a monopolistically competitive market is first, each firm will be selling a price and output combination that lies on its demand curve, which in itself is hardly surprising. Any firm will produce a price and output combination on its demand curve. So that should be fairly self-explanatory. And also, given the demand curve that it's facing, and given the price and quantity combination that it chooses on that demand curve, it will also be maximising profits. So again, those two sound absolutely sensible. No contentious points here at all. The third point, though, we said we're looking about monopolists competing against each other. But the third aspect of the equilibrium in monopolistic competition is that the entry of new firms into the market will have forced the profits of each firm down to zero. So whilst you might think, well, okay, I can understand why we've got 1 and 2, maximising profits, price, quantity combination on the demand curve, no problem. But these firms will make zero excess profits. Okay, and it's this last one where the subtlety of argument comes in. So, next diagram is that one there on the handout. So, this is what equilibrium will look like. Now, what we've got here, we've got the revenue considerations, that is the demand and the marginal revenue curves, and then we've got an average cost curve and a marginal cost curve. So even though you've got this diagram in front of you, practice drawing these things for yourselves. Draw them in the right way. You can draw marginal cost and average cost. Remember something that you would have learned last year. The marginal cost curve cuts the average cost curve at its minimum point. Downward sloping demand curve, it means that the marginal revenue curve, as we saw earlier today, will slope downwards more steeply. And this is what the equilibrium will look like, this precise relationship between revenue and cost curves. Very, very precise. So, the first thing we said, equilibrium is going to occur at point A. So the first thing we said, or point 1, was the firm will choose a price and quantity combination that lies on its demand curve. Okay, there you go. There's the demand curve. Equilibrium occurs at point A. Price is P star, producing a level of output X star. So again, fairly obvious. Price and quantity combination that lies on the demand curve. It's got to. So that was point 1. The second point was this price and quantity combination would be such that profits were maximised. And where were profits maximised? Where marginal revenue and marginal cost are equated. So in our diagram here, that's our marginal cost curve. That is our marginal revenue curve. Marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect at that point there. So the most profitable level of output to produce is the level of output X star. If you produce that profit maximising level of output X star, you can charge a price of P star. So that was point 2. Profit maximising output. And that is where marginal revenue and marginal cost are equated. So those 2 points, fairly straightforward. The third one, though, we said that the entry of new firms into the market would have forced excess profits down to 0. So if excess profits are 0, what does that mean for the firm? It means its price, the price it charges per unit, must be equal to the average cost of producing each and every unit. And what do we find here at point A, that the price charged per unit is P star. And what's the average cost of each of these units produced? It is also P star. So the average cost of producing each of those X star units is also the price. And hence, there are no excess profits. And if you think about it, the only way that you can guarantee that third point is if the demand curve just touches the average cost curve. Because for that point A to be our equilibrium, we need to be on both the demand curve and the average cost curve at the same time. That's the only way that price can equal average cost. And that will only occur when the demand curve just touches, is tangential to the average cost curve. And that is what our equilibrium will look like. However, what I want to do is get you to think, what would happen if excess profits were being earned? I've said point A in the diagram. Point A characterises what the equilibrium will look like when there are no excess profits being earned. Well, what would happen if there were excess profits? Well, in terms of the demand curve, if excess profits were being earned, that would mean that price is greater than average cost. That's what it means if you earn profits. The price that you charge is greater than the average cost of producing those units. So, if that's the case, if profits are being earned, it will mean that there must be some prices that are greater than average cost. So the demand curve must cut the average cost curve. So, if that were the case, what would happen? So all I'm now going to do, I'm just going to strip away those curves that we don't need. Okay? Let's say that this was the situation. That is our demand curve, and these are the same average and marginal cost curves. So, where would this firm produce? What output level would it produce? What price would it charge? Well, the first 2 points don't change. You'll choose a price and output combination along the demand curve. And you will maximise profits. So, what we now need to do, if that's our demand curve, the marginal revenue curve associated with that will just slope downwards more steeply. It's our always that same principle. Downward sloping demand curve, the marginal revenue curve will slope downwards more steeply. So, if that's the marginal revenue curve, where are profits maximised? Where marginal revenue and marginal cost are equated. On the diagram, it's at that point there. So that X1 is the most profitable level of output. It's where marginal revenue and marginal cost are equated. And if the firm produces that level of output, X1, what price can it charge? We'll read that off the demand curve. There you go. That's going to give us a price level of P1. So that's points 1 and 2. A price and output combination that lies on the demand curve. A price and output combination that maximises profits. The marginal revenue and marginal cost are equated. However, that third point, are excess profits being made in this diagram? Of course they are. For those X1 units of output, the price charged is P1 per unit, but the cost, the average cost per unit, read down to the average cost curve, it's lower there at AC1. So the price charged per unit is less than the average cost. And so the vertical distance between the two is the profit per unit. You're charging a higher price than it costs to produce. And that entire shaded area will now be the excess profits. So this cannot be a situation of equilibrium. Because what did we say? If excess profits are earned, there are no barriers to entry. This will attract new firms into the market. And it's this movement of new firms into the market and how it affects the demand curve that brings about the equilibrium. So, strip away everything else we don't need. So that was our demand curve there. I just want you to look at that. Only the demand curve. And think, what is going to happen if more firms enter the market? Well, firstly, if new entrants come into the market, it means that the market share of those firms already in the market will be eroded. So at any given price level, the incumbent firms can now sell less. Their market share is reduced. And so the demand curve will contract inwards. Market share is reduced. So the demand curve comes inwards as more firms enter the market. So that's the first thing. Secondly, though, as well as contracting inwards, that demand curve will also become flatter. It's going to become more elastic. And the reason for that is that more firms enter the market, you have more and more firms producing more and more similar outputs. And so the scope, the ability that customers have to switch from one brand to another increases. Customers become more price sensitive. There are more opportunities to substitute to cheaper goods. And hence, the elasticity will increase and the demand curve becomes flatter. And so as new firms enter into the market, contracts inwards, becomes flatter until eventually all excess profits are eliminated. And what will that look like? This is our new demand curve. And what does it look like? It's that demand curve that we saw right at the beginning. And now we're back to our position of equilibrium. There are no excess profits, and therefore firms no longer have an incentive to enter the market, and so the position of the demand curve doesn't change. There is one final slide. I'll let your tutors cover that with you in seminars.